Hello, everybody. This is Chapter 5, The Problem of an Empire. We'll be going from the year 1754 to 1776. Our essential question for this chapter is, how did Britain's victory over France in the 7 Years' War lead to new conflicts in North America? Remember, if you have to, you can pause this video so you can write down the essential question. So leading up to this chapter, we have already talked about what the colonies are like in the 1700s. So far, we've seen that European powers have been fighting over control of North America, and specifically, we've been discussing Great Britain and France. We've talked about a few different wars, like King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, all of it over control over North America and its resources. So all this is going to lead to, in 1754, what becomes known as the French and Indian War. You might see sometimes it discusses the 7 Years' War, because the term French and Indian War makes it sound like it's the French versus the Indians, when actually it's going to be French and Indian allies versus the British and Indian allies. So Great Britain will take over Canada, or parts of Canada, and different American Indian tribes will join the French or join the British, and they'll basically try to align themselves with whoever they think is going to win the war, and they'll even battle other traditional native enemies. So here you can see in this map, what's in purple is held by the British before the war. Then afterwards, the French lose the war, and because of that, the French are basically kicked out of all of North America, and now the Mississippi River becomes the boundary between Spanish territory and British territory. Now, exactly how the war is fought and the battles and everything is not necessarily important, but the results of this war is crucial, because after the war, Great Britain creates a new proclamation of 1763. This is going to basically say that the land west of the Appalachian Mountains, all the way to the Mississippi River, is going to be for Native Americans. And they're going to say colonists are not allowed to cross over the Appalachian Mountains and settle there. So I'll go back to the map just so we can see. So here you can see in red, this is the proclamation line of 1763. So the colonists are supposed to stay on this side of the line. Now, the big reason is because if they cross over, then there's no guarantee that the Native American tribes who are there won't fight them. And so Britain doesn't want to spend a whole lot of money on sending soldiers out to the west to protect the colonists who are there. Regardless of this rationale, the colonists hated it, because they said, well, we just fought for this war, we fought for the British, and the French are gone now. Why aren't we taking advantage of this land we just won? Again, it feels like the colonists are not really cared about, or at least their motivations or what they want is not important. A key thing about the French Indian War, though, is that it's going to dramatically increase the British debt. It almost doubles to 133 million pounds. And to pay for that debt, England is going to tax specific things. These are called excise taxes. When a government says, okay, we're going to tax this one good, like there might be a gasoline tax or a cigarette tax. Those are taxes on specific goods. Now, remember, for a long time now, England has had the Navigation Act set up to make the colonists trade with England only. However, because of salutary neglect, the colonists don't really listen to it that much. Instead, they just kind of do their own thing. And so now that England is starting to tax goods for the colonists almost feel like, okay, we'll keep doing salutary neglect and we won't have to pay for these taxes. But England really needs to get this money, and so they are really intense about getting that money back. And to make sure that they get their money back, and to make sure that um, that the colonists are not moving across the mountains, they send 7,000 soldiers to North America. With all these soldiers coming to North America, that's going to cost a lot more money. So England expects the colonists to pay for taxes to pay for those services. So to pay off this debt, we have a new Prime Minister, George Grenville, and he's going to come up with a couple ways to pay off this debt. The first is the Sugar Act of 1764. Now, it might seem kind of counterintuitive, but what it actually is going to do is actually going to lower the tax on molasses from 6 pence to 3 pence. So the reason why he does that is because then more people would be willing to buy British molasses instead of smuggling French molasses, which is against the navigation laws. So by making it cheaper taxes, more people would be willing to go for English goods and actually pay those taxes. So instead of getting 0 pence because people are smuggling, they're going to get 3 pence because people aren't smuggling. Now, people like this man, John Hancock, have made a lot of money smuggling over the years. And so what John Hancock is kind of upset about is that now he's going to lose a bunch of money off this. So him and other colonists begin to question why they didn't have any representation when this tax was created. Now, if you were suspected of breaking one of these smuggling laws, the British created something called a Vice Admiralty Court. These are courts run by judges appointed by the British, and they look at evidence to see, did you commit this crime? And so this is one thing that the American colonists really don't like, because they don't have control of these courts. They're not looking at each other to see if they committed a crime. It feels like these outsiders, the British, the Englishmen, are looking at them. And like John Adams says in his quote there, the Vice Admiralty Courts diminished equality by degrading every American below the rank of an Englishman. Another way that the Parliament is going to try to raise money to pay for the debt after the 7 Years' War is the Stamp Act. So the Stamp Act is going to require a tax stamp on any official printed documents. And so that just means any documents that are made, like diplomas or court documents, land titles, contracts, and even playing cards, needed to pay to get this stamp posted on the document. It was a progressive tax, meaning that for a newspaper, there's only a penny tax, but it was $10 or 10 pounds for a lawyer's license. So depending on how important the document was, the higher tax you paid. And so this is really starting to get to the colonists. You can see Ben Franklin's statement here: if you choose to tax us, give us members in your legislature and let us be one people. And so there's this argument of no taxation without representation, while the Parliament argued that that the colonists had what's called virtual representation. Virtual representation is the idea that all members of Parliament represent all British subjects. So even though the colonists don't get to vote for members of Parliament, the members of Parliament still represent the colonists. Parliament also passes the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act says that those 7,000 British soldiers that are now in the colonies must be provided barracks, so homes, and food by the colonial governments. And the reaction against this was swift and severe. Some colonists created what's called the Stamp Act Congress, 9 colonies were so upset by this that they sent representatives to try to figure out how to get rid of the Stamp Act, but only 9 of the colonies attended. While in Boston, where there's most of the um, um, opposition, a group called the Sons of Liberty starts harassing tax collectors. They burn in effigy tax collectors. So it's basically where you take a mannequin and you burn them in the city square. In some cases, they even have tar and feathering, which is a really terrible punishment for somebody. You take boiling hot tar that's used for the outsides of ships. You pour that on people. Usually, you strip them naked, pour the tar on them, and then cover them with feathers. So usually, the person's covered with the second and third degree burns. It's really quite terrible. Now, some of the background for why people are opposing this, some people use new Enlightenment ideas that was coming out of Europe at the time. John Locke had a theory that individuals possess natural rights, that just for being born, we have the right to life, liberty, and property. And so many colonists started to espouse these ideas. However, they rarely would then extend it to African American slaves. Now, eventually, Prime Minister Grenville would be replaced by a new man named Charles Townshend. And by this time, the Stamp Act is even unpopular in England because they believe that that it's not leading to more exports, and so Great Britain's not making enough money. And so they get rid of the Stamp Act. But when they do that, they also pass what's called the Declaratory Act. Declaratory Act says that Parliament can basically do any laws they want, and the colonies have to listen. They're declaring their power to do whatever they want. Townshend also got Parliament to pass a series of Townshend Acts, so increasing taxes on paper, paint, glass, tea. And so with all these increasing taxes, colonists began to boycott. This is an economic form of resistance that the colonists could use. And so this reduced the amount of goods imported into the colonies, meaning England was getting less money. But it also led to the colonists trying to produce their own goods, their own finished goods. And there's been so much resistance among the Sons of Liberty and other groups in Boston, Parliament sends an additional 2,000 soldiers to Massachusetts specifically. Here you can see in this graph, the green line is how much stuff is being sent to Great Britain, and blue is how much they're getting from Great Britain. And so you can see this gap here. This is the trade deficit. So for a country, if the colonists were a country, this is really bad because they're having to spend more money on stuff from other countries rather than selling stuff to other countries. Many merchants and manufacturers asked to get rid of these taxes because of the boycotts affecting their businesses. And so Parliament said, okay, we will get rid of the taxes except for tea. We're going to leave the tea tax on because they wanted to just basically show that they could do whatever they want. Meanwhile, in Boston, a group of British soldiers were out on patrol and fired into a crowd of colonists that killed 5 townspeople. Soldiers said that they feared for their lives and that it was an accident. Eventually, they went to trial in the colonies, and they were found not guilty. Later on, England said that the colonists could not possibly have a fair trial, and so they
sent them to England to get retried, even though they were found not guilty before. Colonists called this the Boston Massacre, and it led to more feelings of brokenness and divisiveness between the colonists and England. Here you can see an image that was used as propaganda against the Boston Massacre. In the drawing, you can see a couple things. You can see the colonel leading them is behind them, telling them to fire, which actually wasn't true. He was out front trying to talk with the people to convince them to leave. But one thing you see at the bottom is this little dog. The dog is supposed to say that, look at how bad the British are treating the colonists. They're treating them worse than dogs. And so this Tea Act sent a tax on tea, and the British had been working with the corporation, the East India Company, that would sell tea to not only the colonies but the rest of the world. And they were in debt and had a lot of tea in surplus. The colonists began to smuggle in Dutch tea, and so Parliament created what's called the Tea Act of 1773. And so, but what they basically said is they're going to give the company a loan, and basically they make more money if they sell it to the colonists. They don't have to pay any special taxes to the English government. And so what they're trying to do is to make it cheaper for the colonists to buy the British tea instead of the Dutch tea. And the colonists are upset because they feel like the British are trying to tell them what to do, and so they boycott the British tea. They don't want to have an English monopoly where the English are in complete control over all the tea that they drink. And so in 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty went on to ships in Boston Harbor that had the English tea in it and threw the cargo into the water in the Boston Tea Party. Here you can see an image of the Sons of Liberty destroying the tea, throwing it in the harbor. You can see they're supposed to be disguised as Native Americans. The king is outraged by the Boston Tea Party, and so he gets Parliament to pass the Coercive Acts. The Coercive Acts are a series of laws, including the Boston Port Bill, which closed Boston Harbor to shipping. This is the number one way that the people of Boston make money, and so this has taken away all their ability to make money. The Massachusetts colony loses its charter, so they're no longer able to meet in town meetings. They're going to build more barracks for more soldiers coming to Boston. If a colonist commits a crime in England, they would have to be, if they commit crimes in the colonies, they would be sent to England and be tried in courts there. So while Parliament called them the Coercive Acts, the Patriots called them the Intolerable Acts. They're not able to tolerate it. So in response to these laws, colonists got together in Philadelphia as a Continental Congress. 12 of the 13 colonies arrived, and they talked about what they wanted. Southerners wanted more economic boycotts. Northerners wanted to prepare militarily, and middle colonists want some kind of compromise. The delegates said that we need to get rid of these coercive acts, and we need to regain our rights as Englishmen. Meanwhile, Parliament is doubling down. They say not only will they send more soldiers to the colonies, but the Americans have to pay for those new soldiers. They're also going to blockade more American exports, so Americans can make less money. But it's important to know at this First Continental Congress, no one is talking about independence. That's not something that they're talking about. No one is talking about that publicly. Now, some colonists are suspicious of the Patriot movement. They feel that some colonists are wanting to be problematic so they can get more powerful and more rich. Some believed that if they resisted, that the colonies would lead to anarchy and disorder, and many people just didn't want to get involved at all. Many loyalists would face persecution, harassment. Many would be forced out of their homes, especially after the war. Now, while to resist against to resist against England, New England are going to try to close royal courts, try to regain power in their own town meetings. They're going to harass loyalists with more burning in effigy, tar and feathering. And so some patriots began to gather weapons together, and they would form militias known as Minutemen to be used as a defensive force. So that way, if the English soldiers were coming to destroy or take over a town, the people of that town could defend themselves. One military governor, his name is Thomas Gage, heard that there were heard that there were weapons in the town of Concord, a couple miles away from Boston, and he sent 700 soldiers to go get those weapons. Word got out from Paul Revere and some others that the soldiers were coming, and the weapons were moved before they arrived. However, militiamen confronted the British regulars at Lexington, and something happened. We don't exactly know who shot first, but a bullet went off, and this was the shot heard around the world. The British eventually would fight back, and it led to 70 British soldiers being killed. And this was the start of fighting and conflict in the Revolutionary War. Here you can see an image showing the fight at Lexington Green. One man, asking why he fought at Lexington Concord, said that what we meant in going for those redcoats was this: we had always governed ourselves, and we always meant to, and they didn't mean we should. So he wants to govern themselves, and they're feeling like the British are not letting them do that. And when this starts to happen, many people believe that reconciliation is not going to happen. They're not going to be treated as Englishmen anymore. And so representatives from all 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia in the Second Continental Congress. While they're meeting to try to regain their rights, more British soldiers attack Patriot troops at Bunker Hill just outside of Boston. John Adams, in response to this, calls for the creation of a continental army to defend against the British for their liberties. George Washington would be its first general. Now, at the Second Continental Congress, most delegates are talking about how to get their rights again. Most are not talking about independence. In fact, in June of 1775, the Second Continental Congress sends what's called the Olive Branch Petition to King George III. They were saying they were loyal to the king, and all they asked was to repeal the oppressive taxes and laws. The king says no. In fact, anyone in the Continental Congress could be hung for treason. So what is the goal of the fighting? That kind of is, for a lot of the Congress, the argument. One man named John Dickinson, he just wants reconciliation, and he wants to get the rights of the colonists back. John Adams begins to want independence, but he's really not supported by most of the other delegates, and he doesn't really say it publicly out loud in the groups. That is until January of 1776, when Thomas Paine publishes the book Common Sense. He calls for independence and a Republican form of government. You can see that's a lowercase r Republican. That means the people get to vote for representatives in the government. Paine is going to shape public opinion towards independence and encourage more people to think about the idea of being separated from England. And here you can see a quote there. You can read that on your own. Now, 6 months after Common Sense is published, more and more people have begun talking about independence. And Richard Henry Lee, the delegate from Virginia, presented a resolution to the Congress for independence, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. Some anti-independence delegates actually left the Congress, and so that would actually help the Congress to be more pro-independence. And on July 2nd, 1776, Congress approved the independence measure. And John Adams would write a letter to his wife saying, the second day of July will be the most memorable day in the history of America. The reason why we remember July 4th is because that's when the document itself was ratified. So the Congress approved independence on the 2nd, but approved the document on the 4th. Another misunderstood myth is that all the colonists or all the delegates did not sign all on the same day in a big line. Most would sign in August. Some would not even sign until January of 1777. And there you can read the document. That's part of it. When in the course of human events becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands, they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So a lot of the document is just a list of grievances the colonists have with England. But here you can see one of the most important lines. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so now that they've declared war, there's only one thing left to do. Win the war. If they declare independence but lose the war, none of it matters. Then America is not a country. But they have to win the war. And that is it for chapter 5.